Topic of conversation today is chronic wasting disease. Obviously, people see, I guess you could call it, media coverage of this and, different news about chronic wasting disease circulating, but not a lot of people are really understand exactly what it is. So could you explain that to me to start off, please?
So yeah, it's a difficult disease to understand, number one, but in simplest terms anyway, CWD is an always fatal neurological disease of deer, elk, moose, caused by this infectious protein that's called a prion that eventually affects the animal's brain. There's no vaccine, no means of treating this disease. Many consider it a major threat to deer populations across North America, and CWD is now found in 32 states.
Okay, and then obviously, Texas Parks and Wildlife, there has been some spread of chronic wasting disease throughout the state of Texas. Some of that's in captivity and some of that's free range. Can you just talk to me about what that picture looks like currently in terms of that spread?
Okay, so CWD was first detected in the Waco Mountains in Texas in 2012, and then in a breeding facility in 2015. The good news is, the prevalence of CWD in Texas still remains very low, even in locations such as the Panhandle, Trans-Pecos, where it was initially found, and South Central Texas, where most of our free-ranging detections do occur. To date, we have 624 detections since 2012, impacting 27 different counties. And you mentioned breeding facilities, and they're a part of this whole conversation. And 73% of those detections, those CWD detections, have occurred in breeding facilities. So, the testing is much higher in breeding facilities for a variety of reasons. But the prevalence of detections within breeding facilities, and more importantly at this time for this conversation, I think in free ranging deer, like up there in the Panhandle, the prevalence remains very low.
Okay, and with that said, I guess in 2023, there were 130 something cases, positive cases that were detected in the state of Texas. I guess, that would be considered an increase. Um, I know that the more testing you do, the more positive cases you're going to find. So that's one of the reasons. But I guess can you talk to me about some of those reasons on why we're seeing an increase in chronic wasting disease here in the state?
So let me update your numbers just a little bit, Mitchell. So for calendar year 2023, we've now had, or we had, I guess since we're in the new year, 181 detections in 2023. When you look back at the previous 2 years, as an example, in 2022 we had 170 detections, and then in calendar year 2021 we had 65 detections. So, CWD is increasing on the landscape, both in free ranging deer and in captivity. But also, as you mentioned, you find diseases like this where you look at it. So the intensity that we surveil for CWD is higher in captivity in these breeding facilities. But part of that reason is because the risk is much higher there. The testing that occurs on free ranging deer, we have to rely on hunter harvest, having their interest in having their deer tested if they're in a surveillance zone, or we encounter a hunter at a locker plant and they allow us to obtain a sample for CWD from that hunter harvested deer. And then we literally collect thousands of samples every year from roadkill deer and circumstances like that. So our surveillance is statewide. We're very confident in the surveillance we had, but with more surveillance, the likelihood of finding more disease will occur. And that's kind of the situation we're in right now. But I want to emphasize again that CWD is a concern for us, but the prevalence still remains very low in Texas.
Okay. We're gonna go circle back around to the intensity in which you're looking for CWD, but let's go back to this and talk about what does it look like in a deer? Obviously, I know it can go undetected for a while, but in those final stages before fatality, what can you look for in a deer to sort of identify chronic wasting disease?
Well, what it looks like in a deer is kind of confusing, much like what causes CWD. They're very difficult questions to ask because the reality of this particular disease is you won't visually be able to identify a deer that has CWD unless it's in the clinical stage of the disease, which for most deer may take up to 2 years for those symptoms to be obvious. And when those symptoms are prevalent or obvious, what a hunter, wildlife viewer, somebody that's just out observing deer will see is that deer will typically be in poor body condition. It may be drooling. It may be staggering around. It will appear not as alert as what you expect a deer to be, certainly not wary of normal risk. What we do know is that a deer with CWD is 4 times more likely to die than a deer that does not have CWD. And this death could occur from CWD or a variety of other methods, such as predation from, say, a coyote, getting involved in a vehicle collision, obviously more susceptible to hunter harvest, or die from CWD and a combination of other diseases. So that's what makes it hard to understand, when somebody sees a deer on the landscape or they harvest a deer and they say, well, my deer looked healthy. The only way we can really know, and the best method, is to test that deer for CWD. So we strongly encourage, hunters to have their deer tested post-harvest, or if an individual or hunter sees what they consider a sick deer, or maybe a deer that's just not acting normal, please contact your local wildlife biologist and see if we can lay eyes on that deer, maybe get a sample from that deer and remove that deer from the population.
Okay, that's good information. That was going to be one of my questions towards the end, but you went ahead and answered it there. Um, Talk about how it's spread, and then what Texas Parks and Wildlife is doing specifically to mitigate that spread throughout the state.
Okay, so we know a little bit more, or have a better understanding of really how it is spread, and it's from a variety of methods, mostly from deer to deer contact, and that contact could occur from saliva, urine, feces from the deer, blood, certainly moving live deer in trailers, from a deer breeding facility to a release site. Carcass parts or improper disposal of carcass parts is certainly a concern. Again, on deer in captivity, instruments used on deer for procedures such as artificial insemination, and then simple things that maybe we don't think about regularly. If if an individual was in contact with a deer that was shedding prions, they could transfer that on their clothes. It may be present in feed. There's some belief that certain scavengers may move prions across the landscape, but much of that is under research right now, and we don't know whether, say, a hog or a vulture can move prions at a level that's infectious to a deer. We know that they can move the prions, but can they move them at a level that would infect another deer? So there's a variety of mechanisms, but most of it involves around, that deer to deer contact, or simply moving live deer in trailers that are infected from point A to point B and moving that disease across the landscape.
Okay, now let's talk about kind of what it sort of the threat it poses in deer populations. Obviously, we've seen the more widespread incidents happening in the Midwest and northern parts of the country. It's relatively new here and in our northern neighbor, Oklahoma. So, you said obviously it is going up, but it doesn't pose a significant threat. But what could it do to the deer population? What kind of threat could it pose if it did become more widespread?
Okay, so thinking about those primary factors of how disease is transmitted, that saliva, blood, urine, feces, those kind of things. So CWD is a focal disease, and in that regards is kind of density dependent, meaning that it's not evenly distributed across the landscape or even in deer populations. But if CWD is present in a localized population, higher deer density will only increase the likelihood of spreading the disease to more deer or a larger geographic area. So as an example, if you unnaturally concentrate deer at a feeder or in captivity, those deer have a higher risk of contracting and thus spreading the disease. However, in the big picture, when we talk about deer population in Texas, we estimate that we have more than 5 million white-tailed deer in Texas, and it would likely take decades to notice a downward trend in the population from CWD. But what I want you to remember again is that CWD is a focal disease, so it's going to occur in these pockets. And so if under the unfortunate circumstances you had CWD on your ranch, in your high fence pasture, it would or could have a noticeable effect on that localized population. The recruitment of deer into that population, the amount of fawns that were produced on an annual basis, it would affect the age structure, and eventually you would just end up seeing fewer mature bucks over time. So again, I don't think in the short term we're going to see an impact on this statewide population of white-tailed deer, but it could have an impact on your ranch if in fact you did have CWD on your property.
Okay. And then last thing, you know, especially last week whenever I looked into you know, doing some coverage on this topic, I saw several different articles that talked about potential risk it could pose to humans. Now, I've seen some research that says, hey, that's possible. And then I've seen other things that say we've never really seen it happen, right? So I guess could you talk to me a little bit about that, what that threat looks like, and so we can just sort of address it?
Yeah, so we're not aware of any immediate threat to the health of humans from CWD. There's been lots of tests done on primates, a variety of other animals, and different things like that. But so there's no current threat that we know of to humans from CWD in a deer. However, you know, all your national, state health organizations and Texas Parks and Wildlife recommend to individuals, to hunters, to not consume a deer that you know has CWD. So that we haven't identified, nobody's identified a direct link from CWD going to a deer to humans, but that risk is present. And so we just recommend you have your deer tested. If it tests positive for CWD, we recommend that you properly dispose of that carcass, the remainder of the meat, and not consume that, you know.
Okay. That's pretty much all I had to discuss. I guess one thing I was thinking about is like moving forward, you know, are you going to intensify sort of, I wouldn't really necessarily want to call it a crackdown, but just like, you know, the overall testing that Texas Parks and Wildlife does for chronic wasting disease, is that expected to increase in this upcoming year and hunting season?
Yeah, well, you know, we're just working on the tail end of the current deer season now. You know, we have enhanced surveillance within those captive breeding facilities. We're always looking for opportunities to test more deer from hunter harvest, free range deer across the landscape in Texas. And so we will continue to look for those opportunities where they exist and encourage hunters to have their deer tested. It's free. We'll do that for you. There's various check stations. There's various agency offices scattered across the state where we have staff available to take those tests. And that's the biggest encouragement we'd have is have hunters get their deer tested and understand how to properly dispose of your carcass after you've harvested, whether you do that processing yourself at home or you take it to a locker plant. Proper carcass disposal is important to this whole disease management discussion.
Okay, and then one thing that you had mentioned is, you know, like a processor or, you know, people taking their deer to get processed. I guess as Texas Parks and Wildlife, have they partnered with any processors, or do y'all make like regular trips to, you know, prominent processors in different parts of the state and do testing of the deer that come in for the day? You know,
Yeah, we have great cooperation from many processors, taxidermists, et cetera, across the state, but focusing on those processors that allow our staff to be present during the hours that they're open. Hunter comes in, they're, you know, dropping their deer off, and then we'll voluntarily request that, hey, can we collect a sample, talk to them about CWD, disease management, and collect a sample from those deer that they allow us to do so. And that's the easiest place to do that because of the concentration of hunters and the people that do utilize these commercial facilities to process their deer. But we'll also go to an individual's ranch, you know, if they've got a bunch of people out for the weekend or something that they're, you know, trying to reduce their doe density on their property, and we'll meet them on the ranch, collect samples on the ranch. But processors are very important for us to have the opportunity to get our hands on, you know, large quantities of deer in one centralized location, and we appreciate their support.
Okay. I guess finishing up, is there anything that maybe I missed? Maybe anything that you would like to address or add in to what you've already told me today?
Yeah, I think to just emphasize that, please get your deer tested. The implications of CWD, like I said earlier, are not something we're going to notice necessarily in the short term. It's not a concern for hunters, right now, or they're not going to notice a difference in the deer population now. But my grandkids, or maybe your grandkids, if we don't continue to aggressively manage this disease, it will make a difference to their hunting opportunities in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, it was good meeting you, and I appreciate your time.
You bet.
And I think that'll be it. If as long as you don't have anything else to add.
No, I'm good, Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Yep.